Okay, Phil, good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session of the conference, which is devoted to Kant, actually to Kant's philosophy of mathematics. And it's really a very special occasion. 29 years ago, 30 years ago, there was a conference on Kant's philosophy of mathematics. I have the poster here, at Duke University. And that conference, we could say, baptized the field, gave it its name. The field itself was born about 20 years before that by the appearance of a couple of papers by Jaakko Hintikka, and then a brilliant follow-up by Charles Parsons. Since then, the field has grown and is in fact now a thriving subfield of Kant studies and in philosophy in general. We have today speaking the third generation of scholars of Kant's philosophy of mathematics. We have three individual stars who themselves are part of a constellation, and a real constellation. I think that the field is one of the most exciting things going on in Kant studies, and in fact, a model for philosophy in general. A group of people, from my point of view, young people, who are reading each other's work, writing in concert with each other, criticizing, and in fact creating a body of work which is perhaps one of the most interesting and exciting developments we've seen in Kant studies over 100 years. It's my pleasure to chair today and to introduce them. We'll have opening remarks by Ofra Rechter. Ofra is the co-editor of the volume on Kant's philosophy of mathematics, or the two-volume set on Kant's philosophy of mathematics, which is to appear in Cambridge University Press, hopefully in 2014, which will present the state of the art and the view of the future of this field. Ofra is also the organizer of this conference, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank her for this very, very wonderful gathering. The topic that Ofra will talk about is Kant and mathematical intuition. After that, she'll be followed by Daniel Sutherland and Emily Carson in the opposite order. And then we will have a group discussion and we will open for questions. Ofra.
Thank you, Carl. And okay, again, I should also thank Michael Blansberg, who's been a great support in planning this. And of course, I'm very grateful to Charles Parsons for agreeing to have this. My own thinking about Kant has been pretty much from the beginning very much influenced by Charles Parsons' writings about Kant, but also with Charles's independent original philosophical work, in particular his conception of mathematical intuition, and reading Kant, I always thought, against the odds of many of my colleagues and others in the community, that there's something there's a reason why Charles says that the origin of his notion of mathematical intuition is in Kant. After all, there's a question here, right? I mean, he always qualifies this claim. There's something in particular about what it is in Kant that is inspiring him to attribute a notion of mathematical intuition as original in Kant. And so when I started thinking about the philosophy of arithmetic, I applied myself to making it out that this idea of an intuition of types, an intuition of quasi-concrete objects, is a key to understanding Kant's, at the time, very puzzling and scattered comments about arithmetic in his critical work. Now, there are two general approaches to the idea that intuition plays a role in arithmetic. On the one hand, there's this idea that, well, intuition is associated with the a priority of arithmetic and is associated with the pure forms of intuition, the forms of sensibility, i.e. space and time, and following various remarks of Kant, one generally associates first arithmetic with time. That's been challenged in various ways, but I'm sorry. So although it's pretty clear, it's been clear for a while that arithmetic is not about time, a way of thinking about intuition and arithmetic is based on the idea that somehow time infuses content into the concepts of arithmetic, in particular the concepts of the numbers, in a way that might be similar or might not be similar to the way that geometry is infused by content, i.e. maybe the formal features of space. That's an inspiration that starts with Russell, primarily, and opposing it is the view that intuition in arithmetic has to do with, in some sense, that is prior or distinguishable from the pure sensible forms of intuition, i.e. somehow having to do with the notion, with the form of an object. Now, of course, Kant, as Michael reminded me, and as Charles mentions in several places, certainly in Kant's philosophy of arithmetic, the idea of a form of an object is associated with geometry, is something that Kant tells us that we construct an intuition, giving a geometrical example. But I will leave this opposition now. I'll come back to the way, I mean, more recent views of Charles, and I think it's pretty clear reading the schematism that there's going to be a form of an object involved in the case of arithmetical construction. So the 5 dots on a page are the obvious example. So one point I want to make that takes me from the ideas I started with. So the idea I started with was there's going to be some notion of symbolic construction involved, and that and the intuition of types is going to arise from the idea that, well, if there are going to be symbols involved in the construction of arithmetic, they have to be somehow apprehended. I was never quite comfortable with the association with symbolic construction and the claim that arithmetical concepts are symbolically constructed. Is based really on two sources. One is the claim in the Methodlehre, where Kant contrasts the ostensive constructions of geometry with the symbolic constructions of algebra. And that is put together, I think, in many interpreters' minds, with ideas that Kant expresses in 1763 in the prize essay that seem to be echoed by these later comments on construction in the Doctrine of Method. In that early paper, essay, Kant has not yet arrived at the concept-intuition distinction, certainly not the distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. He does make extensive use, well, some use of the notion of an intuition, and he makes he very strongly relies on the notion of a sign. Now that's a sign. It's not clear that that's the source of the influence there, as opposed to other things in that period, is Leibnizian. There may be a contrast with Berkeley here that is, but at all events, putting together the 1763 paper with the comments about symbolic construction in algebra, I think was sort of sufficient for many interpreters to conclude that, well, arithmetic is going to, algebra is general arithmetic, however you construe the generality here, is going to apply to arithmetic as well. Having expressed some skepticism about that, I still think that the original notion of an intuition of a sign that came up early on in the discussions of arithmetic in the 60s is very much present, certainly in schematism. It's present in Kant's discussion of the construction involved in definition. The idea that a concept in mathematics can be defined, and only mathematical concepts can be defined, is based on the idea that, well, unlike the categories, they don't need schemata because they can be constructed, and construction is their exhibition in intuition. I suppose everybody here knows all that. Sorry?
Not everyone.
Okay. So, in that passage in the discipline, what Kant tells us is that in the case contrasted with geometry, what arithmetic does is first and foremost adopt a notation. So it's clear that the notion of a sign or a sensible means for cognition has survived and underwent various transformations. And those transformations clearly have to do with the striking fact that nothing resembling the analytic is even remotely suggested in the early 60s. Whereas Kant uses a very rich notion of intuition. He uses the term syntheticity, applies it to concepts and truths and he certainly uses the notion of intuition. He associates in the 1963 essay the notion of intuition with certainty. And certainty is, well, there's more to say about it. Certainty is a property, is a second-order property applied to an agent associated with the completeness of Merkmale of Marx. In the prize essay, Kant thinks of certainty as coming in degrees, and so also intuition. In the critical period, there's no talk of degrees of intuition, but there's also, coming back to Charles's work, two further claims that come, I mentioned Kant's philosophy of arithmetic and its influence on what I thought. In arithmetic and the categories, Charles makes a compelling claim for the conclusion that Kant had never arrived at a stable position about number. In other essays, he emphasizes that to diagnose some of the difficulties in making out Kant's philosophy of arithmetic, one has to take into account that Kant was not facing the kinds of questions about mathematical objects that he might have been forced to face today. And so, with those two ideas in mind, it seems to me, on the one hand, problematic to look for a notion of a mathematical object or an arithmetical object in Kant, per se. And I don't think that either Allison's direction or Charles' suggestion at some point of there being a strong and a weak notion of an object in play is sufficiently supported. But there's something else going on that's been going on throughout what I've been describing, and that is something that turns up in Charles's own work and has to do with the incompleteness of what he calls the somewhat defectiveness of objects. So the completeness that Kant associated with certainty, completeness of characteristics, that Kant associated with certainty in the pre-critical essay, finds its way to a question of the completeness of an object. And clearly, well, here comes the third, the part where I wanted to use text. In at least two of his, well, certainly two of Charles's papers that are not in works of interpretation of Kant, he draws attention to a passage in the Prolegomena. I haven't looked at the time. I guess in a conference on Charles Parsons, I can read this through. He says, still Kant expressed, this is from Mathematical Thought and its Object. There's an earlier version that's very interesting in the paper that I'm supposed to be commenting on mathematical intuition. Still, Kant expresses puzzlement about how intuition can be a priori, related to the difficulty. Okay, so in section 8 of the Prolegomena, after introducing the notion of pure intuition, Kant writes, an intuition is such a representation as would immediately depend on the presence of an object. Hence, it seems impossible to intuit spontaneously, a priori, because intuition would, in that event, have to take place without either a former or a present object to refer to, and in consequence would not be an intuition. But how can an intuition of an object precede the object itself? The passage I quoted from Charles begins after introducing the notion of pure intuition. Well, pure intuition, let me repeat what I said at the outset. The idea of the pure intuition that plays a role in mathematical construction and in arithmetical construction in particular cannot be simply assumed to be spatio-temporal forms of intuition in the sense in which those are agents of content of the mathematical concepts. So the question, and moreover, if you read as my students have, read the opening paragraph of the Transcendental Aesthetic, you'll find that Kant makes a distinction between pure and a priori. He doesn't always do that, but he very often says, well, we have to have a construction and it has to be done in a priori form of intuition, something of that nature. So that the puzzlement that Charles expresses following the expression of Kant about this question is one way of saying, look, what we need for construction is something that's going to fulfill this role. It's going to have to be general and singular, and carry the validity of general conclusions for everything that falls under the constructed concept. And it also has to be something that is an object, that is given by intuition and therefore by definition is an object, but is not present. But it has to somehow be, in order to be constructed, it has to fulfill these two apparently inconsistent descriptions. This point is crucial if you don't just presuppose that intuition, inherent to the Kantian picture is the idea that somehow intuition and sensibility are sources of justificatory or epistemic basis. Clearly, it suggests itself. Kant tells us, no, you're wrong to think that only propositional things can be the basis of other propositional things. I think there's a way in which intuition can have a force, an epistemic force, but it takes quite a lot of work, and reading just isn't enough to see exactly what that could be and what the notion of intuition and the epistemic force of it could be. So one question is, what is it for an intuition to be a priori by Kant's terms? So a priority is at least, well, a priority officially is not just independence of experience, although he uses that shorthand often. It's being known independently of any evidence, or it can't be refuted by any particular evidence from experience, and it's known as necessary. Well, that seems to be something that is characterized as propositions. How can a priority apply to something like intuition? And here, this is actually a result. This is already a result. This is a claim I'm making that may. So it seems that there are several things going on. There's an idea of the infusion of content from the sensible forms of intuition. On the other hand, this essential idea of intuition being a relation to an object. Those seem to give rise to two very different ways of reading Kant, and ways that have given rise to various attempts to reconcile bifurcation. But well, maybe I should make a few comments and let the session go on, and then we can return to the discussion. I think that one way to there are maybe three comments that I want to make in conclusion for this introduction. One is that there may be more to, however qualified the connection Charles makes between certain aspects of this, there may be more to it than we have given thought to. And the connection and distinction between the intuition of and the kind of evidence that's associated with mathematical claims, with mathematical statements, should be treated with more. These two should be separated, and we should rethink the connection. The second point I would like to make is that it may end up that we don't really need that the notion of a form of an object can be is closer to the notion of the forms of sensibility than we originally thought. That the tension between the two views it's just more work that we need to do. And the third claim that I would like to make is that the problem of this singularity of numerical equality should not mislead us into looking for objects for what it should for these for the semantics of these things. What it should commit us to is to giving an account of the reference of these things. And the idea that, the account that I had developed early on under some of these, under the influence of the connection between intuition of types and symbolic construction, has led, inspired by another comment by Charles in Objects and Logic, that there may be something about a mathematical concept that can be addressed by thinking thoroughly about the categories of quantity. And what I thought was that there are constructive procedures that are associated with calculation. Because what Kant does tell us in the doctrine of method, which is a continuation of the earlier view, is that, as I said, mathematics adopted a notation. So in arithmetic, as he says in the review of Kessner, when we say we can add more units or numbers, we don't consider this to be something that requires or presupposes a whole within which this happens. But it does presuppose something else. It presupposes a disambiguating context of a notation. And once mathematics has adopted a notation, the incompleteness, in the sense that Kant has in mind for it, which is now going to be a matter of the concepts, the completeness of the concepts and the completeness of their construction, is settled. How to handle the fact that these notations are arbitrarily fixed and that any satisfying certain conditions will do, I associated with the notion of a schema, and I thought that there's sort of meta procedure that is unified under the category of quantity, just as by some sort of nominalization process. So it's like a Mahler's Fifth Symphony. But so I still think, okay, so I still think that the relativity to a notation and the relevance of a much later notion of a formal system is in certain ways important. I do not, however, and in that respect, I think Kant does give us. We don't need the notion of symbolic construction to support that. Kant does give us. He says of these singular numerical equalities that they are postulates, immediately certain singular practical judgments, and that they are formulae. Right? They're formulae. They're not. They're something that single claims or principles can have a variety of ways of stating or representing. And so I don't think what I've outlined is very far from true, as you might suspect. But maybe that's sort of starting for a discussion that we can have a little later. And then I can answer everything that was unclear.
Thank you. I'm going to change, as is my wont, I'm going to go back on what I promised. And in fact, Ofra, I hope you don't mind, but actually there are questions. And so since there is time, why don't we, in fact, go back to a traditional format and ask questions as they come up.
I wanted to raise a question.
Ofra?
Ofra could say something about. I want to raise a question that Ofra could say
Microphone.
something about. Or it just could be a question that could be useful for Emily and Daniel start talking. It has to do with the form of object issue. And I'm wondering if there's kind of two different notions of form of object. One is when we're talking about objects of experience. So they're spatial, temporal, and indeed primarily spatial, I would think. And the other, we're allowing for there to be coherent thoughts that don't correspond to object, like if you look God or soul or something. Okay? So one of my favorite passages about form of object, which I happen to have here, is about the triangle in the postulates of empirical thought. I'll just read a little bit of that. So Kant says in the postulates of empirical thought, it may appear to be sure, as if the possibility of a triangle could be cognized from its concept in itself, parentheses, it is certainly an experience, close parentheses, for we can in fact give it an object completely a priori, i.e. construct it. But because this is only the form of an object, it would still remain always only a product of the imagination, the possibility of whose object would still remain doubtful, as something for which something more is required, namely that such a figure is to be thought under pure conditions on which all objects of experience rest. So what makes it a mere form of an object is that all it would be, it would be something whose possibility would remain doubtful, unless we could show that that form is somehow associated with the form of all objects of experience. Right? So that's clearly the thick notion of object of experience, of sensibility, of an appearance. And so I guess probably not too many people think now that when we're talking about numbers, we're talking about objects in that sense. I mean, of course, we can apply arithmetic to objects of experience by measuring them and so forth. Okay. So what if the notion of form of an object that's associated with number and arithmetic is the form of objects of thought? So in the first half of the B deduction, there is a notion of object where there are forms of sensibility as part of its notion. In section 17, it's the unity of the manifold, the intuition in general, or such thing. And it looks like there, I mean, the transcendental unity of that perception would apply to all thoughts, even if they're thoughts that don't have corresponding objects of sensibility, just because they're thoughts of a thinker. And they could be thoughts of God or the soul or what have you. So there's that, and then there's the passage in the Aesthetic, comments on the concept of time, where Kant says, time has a much greater generality than space, in that all representations are in time, whether they have an object or no, or while some of them are also spatial, and those would be more like the triangle case. So I'm wondering if that helps thinking about how time as the form of inner sense and kind of the form of all unification of a manifold for us humans, which is prior to any kind of synthesis that would synthesize an object of experience for us, but it would synthesize our thoughts to at least be coherent thoughts of a thinker, whether they have an object or no. Or that might have gone long enough, but I'm wondering if that distinction, contrasting the triangle case with the arithmetic case, and paying attention to the passage about time affecting all of our representations and space having, is it all helpful? And then one could try to say, well, look, what happens in arithmetic is, all thoughts whatsoever are going to have to be somehow represented for us by, some words or something, and therefore we could reflect, I'm going a little bit too far now, we could reflect on that and come up with this system of notation business. And this would all be kind of prior to objects of experience. So does that help? I invite you to think about it, and I would hope, I'll ask you again if you don't.
So you think that there's a way of thinking about thought in time that would give rise to an account of what the notation business is?
But it could be associated with it. I mean, because if you think, in the first half of the deduction, you don't have time or space, I think. So that's even more abstract.
Right, so there you...
But then if you take account of the priority of time over space and the aesthetic, you then have a next stage where you can accommodate the essential temporality of all thoughts for us. That would connect arithmetic with time, not in terms of objects, but in terms of the form of thought. I don't know, this is just something that I started thinking about while listening to you.
Well, one has to say something about why why, even when construction of the concept of the numbers in intuition, in pure intuition, is discussed, it's often almost always, and he almost always adds, and this has to take place in time.
It involves succession.
But he says that even when he emphatically denies, I think, that time has any influence on the properties of the numbers, and the numbers are. So there are places where he goes pretty far in thinking about numbers as atemporal, or as things that don't have the sort of properties that can be altered, or as things that don't have that kind of logic. So
an alteration is an object of experience.
that's right. So that's, I guess one of the things I maybe clarify, I'm not sure that's answering the question how pure intuition and temporal intuition interact are, I think of time in the context of arithmetic as mostly a kind of super medium of generalization. So it's a one-dimensional.
Yeah.
And I take that almost literally. So the idea is that there are certain things you can't reflect. You're in time, you're going to be barred from observing certain things or from making certain generalizations. And that's part of the clue for the square root of 2 business in the letter. But one has to, this answer has to do with the separation between the question what the concept of the numbers demand for the singularity of these qualities, from the question of the status of what might be the concept of number. Kant doesn't speak of the concept of number. Of course, he says the number is the schema of the category of quantity. That's a very important claim. But what...
Daniel will have to explain that.
If he has a concept of number, I'm sorry. It's a very nice question whether the concept of number is a mathematical concept and hence constructible, or a metaphysical concept, or something else.
There's time for one more question, if anyone would like. Yes.
It seems to me that Kant's synthetic a priori perception of mathematics is as close as I know to the idea that mathematics is internal to human beings, or at least earthlings, and does not exist in the outer world. Is this true? Oh.
You mean it's true that it doesn't exist in the outer world? Well, maybe the way to answer that is to go back to the passage, the Prolegomena passage. I mean, some readers, I think there's a really nice contrast that's very useful pedagogically to look at how Charles Parsons and how Jaakko Hintikka read that very passage, the Prolegomena 8. So Kant poses the question, how can an object be an object? How can something be an object of intuition and not be present? And the answer Kant gives in the next section is, well, it's a form. It's a form of intuition. That's a difference. And one way, and he then says, forms are things that are contributed by us and so on. And both Jaakko and others, I think, see the point of that answer as introducing the question of ideality. So what is, and that's supposed to resolve the matter. And of course, the question remains, what is intuition, pure intuition, or in this case, whatever intuition is involved, an intuition of, and or what happens to the, what to make of the notion of the relation between form and object under this, I mean, supposing Kant didn't just shift into subject.
Okay, I think I very much want to thank Ofra, and we should all thank Ofra. We have a couple of minutes before the next session starts. Let's take a quick break and then go right to the next session.